right, welcome 20 of you and whoever else is joining. We're here talking tonight with Roxanne Jackson about her work. I'm Nina Levy, the head of the sculpture department here at the New York Academy, and we are so delighted to have Roxanne here to talk about her work. Roxanne is a very prolific maker, and she really hits the four quadrants that you would be interested in, sort of the Venn diagram of what makes a compelling artist. She's very invested in traditional craft of beautiful handmade objects and has an informed dialogue with the history of ceramics and decorative arts, but she also makes conceptually driven multimedia works of art. Her work engages with pop culture that's both mainstream and, I'm doing the scare quotes, lowbrow and incendiary. And she has also, acts as a curator and organizer in community building and activism. So she's not just sort of, a self-interested maker, but it also creates events and opportunities for other people to sort of broaden the conversation. Roxanne is incredibly prolific and has a remarkable exhibition history and a bibliography, which I, strongly recommend that you take a look at on her website. She has upcoming shows in Athens and Paris. She's presently exhibiting at Jeff and Marfa. She's shown throughout the world, including many New York venues, including a two-person show at the Hole, Catinca, this is where I mispronounce everything, Catinca. You know what, I'm just going to say she's exhibited a lot in New York and has upcoming exhibitions at Metrotech in downtown Brooklyn, at Toulouse Fine Art, and also in Brooklyn. Press for her work includes the New York Times, the New Yorker, the LA Times, Juxtapoz Magazine, and so many more. She has participated in many residencies, including the Shigaraki Ceramic Culture. It was so fine when I practiced this before. Ceramic Cultural Park in Japan, the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art, Socrates Sculpture Park, and the Wassaic Project in New York. She's been an active curator and organizer of exhibitions and performances, including notably the Heather Metal Parking Lot, a multi-year collaborative and immersive field party at the Wassaic Project, and Nasty Women, an exhibition which the inaugural event was in Queens. She was a co-founder of that, raised $42,000 for Planned Parenthood, and spun off into 30 sister shows worldwide, raising a remarkable amount of money for women's rights and social services. So I think that's enough for me. So welcome, Roxanne. We are delighted to have you.
Thank you so much. What a nice introduction. I'm going to get started. Okay, so share screen. Also, thank you all for joining. I know it must have been a tough commute. Just a little Zoom joke there. Okay, let's see. Let me go. I'm going to move this bar. Sorry, let me just get oriented here and do this. Okay, and then do this. All right. So I like to start with a piece from graduate school, which was a long time ago, just keeps getting farther and farther away because I'm talking to students and I think there's some relevant things here. So this sculpture I made is ceramic and it is covered in turmeric, the spice, and also red vermilion powder. The antlers are cast resin and the intestines are also ceramic. And this is just an example of the kind of work that I was making when I was in graduate school. I was making a lot of deer sculptures that were modified and also using a lot of mixed media. And so this was part of my visual language. And I went to a fairly traditional ceramics program, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. When I say traditional, I mean very traditional in the ceramics realm. It was regarded as a very great school, but also it was really like vessel centric and utilitarian based primarily. So I was kind of like one of the only sculptors, definitely the most radical sculptor, I would say at the time. And what I'm trying to get at is I would always be outvoted when we as grads would vote to bring in visiting artists. Anyone I recommended was never voted in. So that's fine. I never got my choice. So that meant that I would be in a room having a critique with someone, for instance, this literally happened, who made pristine porcelain utilitarian pots. And so I'm supposed to have a great conversation with this person because we're united because we both work with clay. And I think it's interesting. It's like, does someone who makes metal sculpture have a critique in their studio with someone who builds cars? You know, it's kind of interesting that we're just united by the material, even though the ideas could be so vast. This person came into my studio, saw this piece in particular, and said to me, there's already so much pain in the world. Why not make something beautiful? So that you can see that's the title that I chose for my piece. And I was kind of offended at the time. And also I felt like we weren't really getting each other. She wasn't getting my work. But what she taught me in that moment was, oh, I was questioning notions of beauty. I didn't consciously know that I was doing that. I didn't actually know that I was like finding beauty in the unexpected. And then that was like part of the thing that I was supposed to do with my work. So she actually fortified sort of one of my artistic visions. And also I'm showing you this image because this is a deer that's kind of disemboweled, and it's referencing the ephemeral nature of ourselves and our body in this life. Like I traveled to India and Nepal for 7 months before I went to grad school. And I saw lots of sculptures outside that were, you know, part of ritual and prayer that would be covered and decorated with impermanent materials like this. And that was to reference the fleeting nature of the ego and the impermanence of this body. So I reference that a lot in my work, as you'll see. And then that's also why there's intestines here. Oh, this isn't going on to the next image. It's not letting me move on to the next image for some reason. Okay, that's interesting. I had to stop share. Hopefully this is gonna work. Okay, yeah. So here's a detail just to show you those juicy intestines. They are ceramic with glaze and then just covered in some resin. Okay, and then I just skipped lots of years, I think 9 years. I had a solo show with this artist-run gallery in Brooklyn and Bushwick.
We're not seeing your screen, just FYI.
Oh.
You need to share it again. There you go.
Okay, hopefully. Let me just see if I can.
That'll let you, it's still
okay,
yeah,
that's working, right? Yeah, we're good. Okay.
Cool.
So this show called Death Valley, I had in Bushwick. And at the time I was making a lot of different work and really doing a lot of mixed media and also working with paper mache and different materials. And I wanted to show as much work as possible, but I didn't want to, you know, I wanted it to feel united. So this is a custom pedestal, like a 3-tiered pedestal that was built inside the space that I showed 21 sculptures on. And you can see there's quite a variety in material and also scale of objects. So I'm going to show you some of these pieces that were in the show, then we'll move on. So this is one of the pieces that spanned 2 tiers of the pedestal. Also, this sculpture had to partially be built on site because of the components. So one thing that I am doing with my work, and also was maybe referencing more directly previously, was I was pulling images and themes from horror films and also sci-fi horror, because I just think it's interesting when there's elements of transformation in these films that everybody is watching. Like I think a lot about why so many people are really into horror films and also sci-fi. There's some kind of reference to the supernatural. And I'm particularly interested, like I said, in transformation within that realm. So this, I sometimes read books about sci-fi and horror, and I was actually reading the Vampire Chronicles and also a Cormac McCarthy book at the time that I did this, which inspired what's happening with the figure, the gray figure. So another thing that I'm thinking about with this is kind of like lowbrow really comes into play here. These figures are made out of ceramic, and I wanted to, you know, have this horror kind of scary scene done with these innocuous materials that we associate with craft. So we associate ceramics quickly with craft. If I'm in the elevator and somebody asks me what I do and I say I'm a ceramic artist, they don't picture this probably. They picture something else. So I like to really push these boundaries a lot. The gray figure is flocked. So that is something that is very crafty. You know, think of little Easter bunny kitsch that you get, that fuzz that's on them is flocked. The hands of the gray figure are my hands that are cast from a kit where I was supposed to make prayer hands. Like everything is so kitschy and so comforting and so like innocuous, like I said. And then the material that's connecting their vacant faces is yarn. So that is sort of a summary of a really exaggerated like horror image that I could make from as many crafty materials I could think of as the time. And then they're wearing track jackets, which really isn't crafty, but it's definitely 90s. And then also I spent a couple summers doing residencies where there were no ceramic facilities, because sometimes I think about, am I really an artist? What if I don't have a kiln? What would I do if I'm just in a room? So I actually did play around with that for a little bit of time. So this is done during one of those residencies in upstate New York. And this is a harpy. So in my mind, it's like a modern day contemporary sort of pop culture harpy. I want to think about mythology and these things that have influenced us over time that lots of cultures have riffed off of. But I want to also riff off it and make something that looks like it comes from me, but also comes from the time that we live in. So this is my harpy. And if you don't know, a harpy is part predatory bird and part female. They used to do terrible things to sailors, like pluck them out of the boats and drop them on an island, steal all their food so they would starve to death, etc. So this is my version. And it's paper mache and chicken wire, and then lots of mixed media that you can see. And her pedestal are cinder blocks. So she's like kind of urban, definitely from the city. It's not painted. It's kind of the antithesis of ceramics. With ceramics, I can do so much with glaze, and I use a lot of luster and everything's shiny and so pretty. And this is just mostly the raw newspaper and then just raw duct tape and even raw chicken wire exposed. And I'll show you a detail here. It's pretty scary, but I like this piece a lot. It was in the show I just showed you. And I see her as like being really into metal, maybe even like black metal. And then also kind of like this idea of neo-shamanism. I'm from California, Northern California originally, and have lived in all these places in the woods. So I see a lot of things like this, collections with deer antlers and deer parts and fur. So that sort of is the material choice I use for this piece. And then monster paws. So I make lots of different work. And to be honest, sometimes it's hard for me to put a nice, tidy, cohesive lecture together, because not everything is made in chronological order. So I'm trying to keep it succinct, but like I just make lots of different forms. So I'll talk a little bit about these monster paws. I've made many, more than 20. I'm still making them today. And I think about the image of the hand, because I don't really know why, but I think some of the reasons are that, pictographs. So some of the first art that we have discovered were the image of someone's handprint on the inside of a cave. And I think about that a lot, like how important, like somebody's marking themselves with their hand. And then also clay is also one of the first art forms, and clay is so tactile. And often we see fingerprints in the clay. So I think this is one of the reasons I'm using this as an image. Another thing that I'm thinking about, well, all of these hands are oversized, so that's why they're called paws. So these are very large. I don't have the dimensions on here, but I'll show you some pieces that have some context. So in my mind, it's like it's like a severed hand or a dismembered hand of something that the viewer has to kind of fill in the rest. So I think it's kind of powerful to just give a section of the body. The viewer then, on a subconscious level, on some kind of level, is going to imagine what the rest of it looks like. Is it a Sasquatch? Is it a mermaid? Is it something else? What does the face look like? And I think this is a really interesting way to pull the viewer in and to engage the viewer. So I made this in Japan. I used a lot of different clay bodies. I was at Shigaraki Ceramic Cultural Park in 2019. And so this is a pink clay body. The fingernails are the raw color of the clay. And what's happening with that glaze, the glaze is kind of a peachy color, but the black and the white that's melting through. So in Japan, they use a lot of clay bodies that aren't pure, meaning in this clay, there's mica inside the clay. So the mica flakes are actually melting into the glaze. And I just love this so much because, of course, in the States, all of our clay is so refined and it's so pure and it's like not as beautiful as this. So I really love that idea. And here's just a detail here. I was eating a lot of sushi in Japan. And also I'm really into these magnets. I have one on my fridge right here that sort of really look like realistic food, but this is ceramic. And then this is another piece. So some of these monster paws have a utilitarian element to them. So this is a candle holder, because again, this is something that's really aligned with ceramic history, like kitsch and utilitarian objects, like objects that have some kind of physical purpose, like they hold coffee or they hold a candle. But within this context of this piece, the candles, which are actually just regular taper candles. So maybe you get a better idea of the scale of this piece. It's very big. It's the monster is providing a space for potential meditation for the viewer. So it's like the monster is providing like a space for prayer or something, because the palm is actually full of crystals and minerals and also chains that can be moved around. Nothing's glued on. So the viewer can actually add to or take away. And I am playing around with glazes a lot with these pieces in particular, lots of really textured glazes. I also fire things multiple times to build up layers of glazes. And sometimes I'm even firing at different temperatures. So here's just a detail. And the nails are done. The nails are always done sort of excessively with some kind of ridiculous manicure to kind of reference just civilization and culture. So this is from not just an animal, but it might have a cool haircut. That's what I want people to think about. And here's another one. So this is a mermaid paw. Maybe you can see there's some webbing in between the fingers, and they all have fur on them, but this fur I like matted down with a gel medium to make it look more mermaidy. I don't know what mermaid fur would look like, but this is what I imagine it would look like. So this is a great example of me firing something multiple times to really build up textured glazes. I wanted this to look like it was almost a relic of something pulled out of the bottom of the ocean, because it's a mermaid, and then it's holding something, but in this case, it's a piece of coral. And this is called pearl clutching. Pearls become relevant later. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Is the base, do you think of that as really part of the piece on this one, or can these, I mean, it's the reflection is lovely.
Oh, yeah.
These two, the bases seem like, sort of an integral presentation.
Yes. So I have had custom pedestals made for me. I like these pedestals. I know you're also talking about the reflection. I like these pedestals that you'll see with a lot of these pieces because they're so simple and geometric. And I like that complementing figurative work, or even complementing work that's a little bit over the top maybe. And the mirrored surfaces, I think, yeah, they allude to a ghost, like a ghost image of the piece. Or also on some of my work that will come up that are more symmetrical. I think of them as almost like three-dimensional Rorschachs. They have their ghost image. So it completes the image. So I definitely love to have a reflective surface underneath the sculptures. And I basically kind of do that whenever possible. And yeah, so thanks for asking. Ask any question, Nina. Sorry, I'm just like, I'm probably going to talk a lot, but you can interrupt at any time. Okay. Detail. Okay. And then here's another one. So this piece is called Delft Punk, another monster paw. It's a candle holder. I think it's ridiculous how this candle is coming out of the finger. So I play with that in a lot more works. So we see the blue and white here. So some things I'm thinking with the blue and white is that's a very traditional decorative art tradition that pretty much most people have some kind of association with. I have dishes like that in my cabinet. You go to a museum, you'll see some blue and white ware. Maybe it's from China, maybe it's from Persia, maybe it's from Iran, maybe it's from Mexico, maybe it's from Europe. So what I'm specifically referencing here, because this piece is not porcelain with cobalt painting on top originally came from Persia, and then China adopted that and they were very successful of doing, making china or porcelain painting with cobalt for thousands of years. And that was exported widely. And then in Europe, which is what I'm referencing here, mainly the Dutch, but also the English made their own version because they wouldn't discover what porcelain clay was for at least 500 years after the Chinese. So in Europe, they used a different color clay body that they painted white and then painted it with the blue. They did the same thing in Mexico, a similar thing in Mexico. Anyway, blah, 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 TMI. This is my reference, but I think of it as a riff of a riff because this is not porcelain. And also these images are decals. They're not hand painting. So I call it like a riff on a riff. And I'm referencing the history, but I'm also making it really contemporary with the eyeballs emerging out of the palm. So it's sort of like irreverent. It's an irreverent and reverent nod to craft and tradition in my mind. I'm also thinking again of the hand and how decorating, using the ornate in this way is sort of like tattooing part of the body, which you'll see more reference to this later. And then, I love the gold luster. So lots of gold everywhere. So these kind of like bleeding manicured nails, but bleeding gold, not red. And then, yeah, so again, talking more and thinking more about the tattooed body. I started playing around with a different palette, like also not just doing blue and white, but doing like black and white. And sometimes, with a little bit of red or a little bit of pink. So this is a different version of the same thing called Black Hearted. With these decals, I'm cutting shapes. So I'm ordering pre-made decals that are really dense prints of flowers that are black. And then I'm cutting out shapes like the number 13 or a snake or an ankh or shapes like a knife to reference more kind of like tattoo imagery, as you can see here. And then, more eyes coming out of the palm, but in a different style. And also rhinestones. And okay, yeah, so many. This is another candle holder. This is just an example of me like making frosting with clay. So I put some clay and water in a blender and made a slit, put it in a piping bag and sort of decorated this piece of cake with it. So the whole piece is ceramic except for the fur. And it's the idea is that there's a little bit of more of a funny story behind it. I'm thinking of a monster, it's its birthday and it gets a piece of like cherry cake with chocolate frosting and it takes a big bite out of it. And then the candle, which is a taper candle, is sort of like the candle that you would put in a piece of birthday cake. So maybe the monster beast that owned this hand had a birthday that was 1 year old. And then we see some of these emoji mouths. So I'm showing this piece to kind of show you that now the emoji mouth starts to make its way into my work, which you'll see a lot more in previous works. And then you can see sort of the skin of this piece is really textured with layers of glazing, but I use a lot of crawling glazes. So instead of when the piece gets to temperature, instead of the glaze just becoming like liquid glass and then cooling, so it's just shiny, the glaze is designed to crawl and pull away from itself. And I'm going to show you this piece I also made in Japan because I was thinking of like where I come from, California, growing up in the 80s there and like skateboarding art. So I feel like it's good to see this piece with the video. And this is reminiscent of sort of my childhood and growing up. So Jimbo Phillips from the 80s, actually, he was also doing this work in the 70s, designed a bunch of graphics for Santa Cruz skateboards. And I'm from the East Bay in California originally. So I really grew up around this and people that skateboarded all the time. So I wanted to, this imagery was so planted in my head and like inspiring and interesting to me as a child growing up and as a teen that I wanted to see how that could translate into 3 dimensions. So he, made Narmouth, which I made a piece of, you'll see next. And then also like lots of salacious wolves, maybe this sounds familiar to you, and slices of pizza with melting faces. So that's what's happening here. And then this is a version of Narmouth. This is actually in Marfa right now at the show that Nina mentioned. So this is like Narmouth, but I modified it. And I think it's interesting to like look at something that's really graphic and then work to translate it into clay, which I'll talk more about in this series too. Wild minerals. So another form that I make frequently is I like basically splay heads open, which sounds really violent, but I'm doing that in hopefully a different way that doesn't just seem violent. So this is just a little bit of process of how I build these kinds of forms. So I'll start with, I'm going to make a sculpture in my mind. I'm going to do something with cat heads. So with solid clay, I build 2 cat heads, as you can see on the left. And then you see that one is being cut right down the center. So this is just solid clay. And then the image on the right is that, the heads have already been splayed. I call them splayed heads, and then they're opened. And then the head on the right is inverted and then attached. So then the next step would be kind of like fine tuning and giving it some details. So we can see, I refer to these intestines as like, I think of it like a pearl tiered necklace or a tiered pearl necklace. So we see some intestines, and remember the first image I showed you of the disemboweled deer. So now intestines kind of start peeking and making their way back into the work again. And then we see these unicorn horns. And I think it's just funny and ridiculous because usually you don't hear that plural, you don't hear unicorn horns, but I usually do reference the unicorn, but I always want to do two, not just one, because again, riffing off the mythology and recreating it. And then I have this texture happening that I kind of just loosely refer to as like alien texture. And then the next image will show you this piece glazed. So this is one of the first pieces in this series. And I like to start with it because I feel like you can kind of see really where it comes from. You can see the source, because over time, I think the original source, in this case, a cat head, becomes more and more distorted. And I think that's interesting it's like about the process. These pieces are about the process of building and deconstructing, carefully rendering something only to cut it up and open it and modify it, which I think is really an interesting practice and way to work, because I never know what something's going to look like in the end, which is very different than when I approach a monster paw. I know it's at least going to be in the shape of a hand. So this is a really good exercise for me. And we see a little bit of the blue and white here. We see the tiered intestines. We see some crystals coming out of the eye sockets of the cat. So this is something also I want to talk about, and it refers to the title of this work called Wild Minerals. Is one, working with ceramics and working with glaze, I'm thinking about how the process of ceramics mimics geology. I'm working with clay that clearly comes from the earth. I'm basically sculpting with mud. And then glaze are minerals that also come from the earth. And all of these things on their own, if I wasn't manipulating them, would over time make rocks and make minerals. So I think of myself as kind of like helping the earth make its minerals, but I just want them to like be in this weird shape. So more on this, but also with this piece, I was talking about like Jim Phillips, graphics for skateboards, Narmouth, and translating things like that into clay. With this, I'm thinking more, it's a little more like psychedelic and a little more of an open image. I have a cat, and I think about what he looks like when I look through a kaleidoscope, and how can I translate that image into 3 dimensions? That's hard, but I do an attempt. And so here's another example of what I'm thinking about when I'm talking about geology. This is a head, another head, actually cut totally in half. I'm thinking of a geode, like how a head can be petrified or become fossilized, like over time, to reference transformation. In a way, it's similar to the really scary image I showed you earlier when I was like reading vampire books and looking at all these horror films and talking about the moment of transformation from depicted in horror films or sci-fi. But I can also think about that in terms of geology, or how a head can transform over time. And like I said, turn into a fossil, or be something that's futuristic or even prehistoric, or something that just morphs. And I'm thinking of that also because clay is malleable, and then we fire it and then it hardens and turns into a rock. And then glaze is liquid, and then we fire it and then it crystallizes onto the surface. So with ceramics, everything is always in flux. Ceramics is capturing parts, liquid glaze melting, and then it captures it in a moment and freezes it. So you can see some melts happening in this piece. So the process is actually informing the imagery. And I think that's really inspiring and interesting. This head is inspired by a bat and a bat skull. So here's a side view. And then this is, the New York Times wrote about this piece, and I read that and I was really happy, obviously, because this is the New York Times. But I really like that they said, or she said, that this piece in particular suggests the sawed in half skull of a dangerous mythical creature. And it was just interesting because it seems so obvious, like that was consciously what I was trying to do, but I wasn't. I was really just starting with this bat, cutting it open, going through the process, and then somebody else informs or interprets it in this way, and then that informs later work of mine. So more of these. This piece, well, you can read the titles, but this piece is another bat head, but you can see here, it maybe becomes more further from the bat head. So the bat head just becomes a point of departure. And then in this one, it's altered even more. So I sculpted a bat head, but it was very modified. I'm taking lots of artist liberties here, and then I'm cutting it and opening it, and then I'm sculpting more coming outside of that, and then I'm cutting that and opening it again. So this is one view, but I do want to talk more about the mineral thing. The first image I showed you in this series of the two cat heads called Bark at the Moon, for instance, that was a little more delineated, like the cat noses were glazed like a cat nose and so on. With this, I'm using more overall glaze techniques. So the color will be all over the piece. And then I'm covering it with an iridescent luster to unify the work and make it read a little bit more like a mineral, if that makes sense. Here's just another view of that. So on the right, the profile view, maybe you can see a little reference here to a bat, the profile of a bat with its mouth open. So one thing that also happening here is I like that there might be a slower revealing of the work to the viewer and a different kind of pacing. If you walk up to one of my pieces and it's a monster paw, you'll discover things, but you'll know right away that it's a hand. With these, you don't really know what it is. And I think that that's another tactic or another way to sort of pull the viewer in and engage the viewer. And you can see this pearlescent glaze on it. I'm going to talk more about the pearl as we move on. And then we see the profile view, this glazed drip. So this is another thing I'm fascinated by, is when this happens in work. And sometimes I manipulate the firing and the glazing to get this to happen. It's like that is actually a drip of glaze. And then the temperature of the kiln shut off and then froze it in time. So these heads to me that are splayed, they're sort of referencing like a shapeshifter, because I think how everything in the universe is moving and expanding and changing. Everything is a shapeshifter, just at different rates. We are, rocks are, everything is. And so glaze is doing that too. And I just, again, it's just another example of how the process is informing the imagery. Here's another piece I made in Japan, which is similar, kind of encapsulating all these things, but sort of taking it to another step. So this piece is another head that's splayed open. The head now on the exterior that's cut into is a reptile head. So I'm kind of thinking of this as a contemporary version of a dragon. And then the inside is a human skull. So to me, what's happening here and what I'm trying to do is make a head like a bivalve or a shell, and opening it up, the two parts of the shell, the two parts of the head, the skull becomes the pearl. And here we see, I know it's sideways, but you can see growing inside the mouth of the original head, the reptile head, that's how pearls grow sometimes inside of a shell. And so here's the piece glazed. And then we see the pearlescent glaze on the skull. The human skull is modified, so it's kind of fantastical, but you still recognize it as human, I'm sure. And the glazing on that, I should tell you, Nina, is an example of marbling. So that skull is marbled with a pastel palette. And we'll just move through here. On my father's side, my paternal ancestry is from Mexico, and I'm thinking a lot about like the Mayan culture. You know, after people die, sometimes they would decorate the front of their teeth with semi-precious stones. So the skull is decorated like a piece of jewelry and carved with images that sort of reference contemporary tattoos. And then this is one that I was going to split. So here's an example of a bat head intact. So I put this in here so you could see I'm talking about bats, and maybe you haven't really seen a bat yet and you're like, what is she talking about? So this is more directly bat. But yeah, it's fantastical. The ears are exaggerated, things are exaggerated. What's happening on the left is it's the skull. So on the right, it's more raised. That's the skin that I see as being tattooed. On the left, that is another example of marbling. I just left it matte, so I didn't put a shiny glaze on top. So that's another, just a different palette of marbling on the left. So this is a bat head with the skin that's tattooed on one side and the skull on the other side. So it's split, but now it's split with skull and skin. And of course, everything's fantastical and modified. So I made this piece again and I split it. So this is the form of this one intact. And this, oh, here's another side view of that where you can see the horns. And then this is the other form. So this is what it looked like when I made another piece that I then split. So as you might have noticed, when I'm splitting heads, that sounds really intense, splitting heads. But on the inside, there's no brain, there's no blood and guts, there's something else. I want the inside to seem like magical and mysterious. I want it to be more psychedelic and abstracted. And then if you look right in the center on the top, you can see a gold circle. And also there's gold like pearls. I think of them as pearls sort of emerging, because again, that's how pearls grow inside of a shell. So I'm kind of thinking of us looking inside of a head and then, you know, seeing something that's like abstract and beautiful. And again, like really different. What I'm thinking about also with that center, that gold, I think of it as a golden pearl. That to me, that references the pineal gland, which is supposedly where our consciousness resides. It's supposedly the seat of consciousness. That's how I think of that gold pearl. So it's metaphorical for the kernel of being and like the essence of who we are. And I'm gonna just show you some side views, other views here. Here we see really patterned like tattoo skin on this side and a close-up of the glazing. I glaze fired this piece 8 times to build up more and more layers of glaze. And this is not prowling glaze, it's all glazes that actually like really melt together. And you can see the sort of pearls, the gold pearls emerging, but also the pearlescent iridescent that also, even though you're seeing a gold sphere, you're gonna maybe think of pearl because the iridescent surface. And I'm just gonna show you a quick video of this. Okay, another one that's reptile. And
With the
there's,
multiple layers of glazes, are you really very intentional about how all of that plays out, or is there some sort of, you know, dialogue with the accident of how things melt together?
you know, it's a combination of both. It's definitely accident. Like generally what happens is I'll just fire something until I like it with these layering things. That's something that's really hard to predict. With other pieces, I'm really particular, doing lots of tests. They need to come out exact. But with these ones, yeah, you're right. You're onto something there. I'm kind of being more experimental for sure. Oops. And then this one, it's more layering. I'm going to kind of, I feel like I'm talking too much. So I'm going to move through. This one here, we see more blue and white. This is my interpretation of a devil's head. I was in a tarot show and I picked the devil card. I didn't want it to be red and black. I wanted it to be blue and white. So more referencing the tradition. And then we're going to just walk to the right and we see another example of a head that's cut open that mutates into another form. This is a quote that I share with my students when I have them do an abstract piece. And they're like, why do we have to do abstract? I love this quote by Emerson. The mind, once stretched by a new idea, never returns to its original dimensions. And I think that basically tells us that art makes us smart. And when we see things that we haven't seen before, it expands our consciousness. So she beasts. I'm just going to show you a few of these, but I've also made a lot of busts. So I'm like playing around with this, you know, very traditional trope, like a fragmented female figure that's usually very stagnant. And then I'm kind of combining things I've already told you about, like the slow pace of geological time, a reference to like stalactites, become her face. And then I'm complementing that or offsetting that with trendy references to her hairstyle. Again, we see some pearl earrings. So the pearl is still in the work. And then the snakeskin shirt. So in my mind, this is like doing the same thing that that first image was doing, was like kind of talking about the impermanence of this life and like alluding to something about ourselves that's impermanent or immortal, everlasting. And so here is a detail. Again, this piece is fired multiple times to really build up depth of surface. Another one here, this is more like ice, stalagmite, stalactite bust head. And then I made this piece during the pandemic. This is really large scale. I'll show you some pics that show you the scale more. In my mind, this is a modern day chimera. I used to pronounce that word wrong, chimera. So meaning it's a combination of all these different beasts. It's a dragon. It's also a Loch Ness monster because it's a head, a hump, and a tail. There's all these, I think of it like a conglomerate of like all Western cultures' fears. So there's elements of scorpion, shark, stingray, dragon, Loch Ness, like I already said, and more. I'm going to show you some pics of this piece. This is it installed in a museum in Austria, so maybe you get a better idea of the scale of this work. And here's the head. The scorpion is split. So as the scorpion tail comes and lands, it's split. And then the front of the head is also split. And then the scorpion that's split is holding a little silver skull. That's a little nod to Alien, the film Alien with Sigourney Weaver. So there's a little sci-fi horror nod in there. Here's the hump. So head, hump, tail with the shark fin. Shark fin's removable. So there's some 90s vibe there. There's some tattoos and some piercings. We have 6 breasts here. So this is a nod to the Roman myth of Remus Romulus. So the twins that were suckled by a mother wolf. And here we just see more details. So the back is splayed with the shark fin emerging and this lower back tattoo. So again, 90s vibe. We got some piercings. This is the tail. We have a tattoo, barbed wire, which is like kind of going around the ankle, but it's actually going around the tail. Side view. Glazes. I really wanted this to be pink and green, but I was like really interested in the green, kind of some of the green being really feeling kind of like toxic waste green. And I'm really into glaze. Again, I fired this piece multiple times and tattoos. And when in doubt, put a crab on it. All right, so this is it installed in the Hole, which is a gallery in New York at an exhibition earlier this year called Nature Mort. So again, you get an idea for scale. So that's a really big piece. And then also, in a similar vein, and shortly after the dragon, I made this piece, so my version of Medusa. As many of you probably know, the original Medusa myth, after Perseus decapitated her, he flew over the sand, over the desert with her head. The blood, when it hit the sand, manifested into venomous snakes. So that's supposed to, I'm trying to reference that here with this puddle of blood that's seeping out of her decapitated head. I made this during the election, right before the election. Okay, it's like I needed to get this out. And then you see these snakes emerging from the blood. But I also want to just mention here, one of my favorite paintings of all time. If you don't know it, Google it. Peter Paul Rubens' version of Medusa, where he is depicting this scene where the snakes are emerging from the blood. It's an amazing piece. I actually saw it in person in Vienna. And then also John Carpenter's The Thing, again, some sci-fi horror from 1986, where the alien was a shapeshifter that could mimic forms and the blood had consciousness. So I think this is really interesting, these themes that are overlapping from Medusa, John Carpenter's The Thing, and then also, Rubens' painting of this piece. So here we see the blood with the pearlescent glaze on top, and we see her tongue is forked with a split as her skull is. You see a gold little nugget in there. Again, the pearl, the kernel of bean, and you have eyes. You see what's happening here. Okay, so then I started making some vessels because I've been teaching ceramics online. And so I've been teaching them how to coil build. So then I started making all these vessels. So here we see some of these emoji mouths, again, coming out like of a Delftware piece. And then I started making these forms in black and white. So they become more tattooed with many of these mouths. And sometimes they're decorated with jewelry. So we see a pierced tongue and jewelry. I'm getting close to the end. I'm just going to go through these more. See a wad of gum on the top here to just, again, there's like a irreverent and reverent nod to the history of ceramics with these, just some details. So this piece, I wanted the handles to be this double-headed snake, which it is. I'm almost done here. Here we see the glaze interacting with the flatter glaze of the decal. This is called snake lace vase. And then this led to I just recently made this piece where one thing that's happening with this form and the one right before is the crusty glazes are starting to become part of the vases. So the sculptural glazes and the sculptural components are now becoming part of the vases. So it's sort of melding these two works together, and the handles being encrusted and the foot of the vase sort of mimic what's happening with the snails crawling or slithering, whatever, crawling, slithering all around the vase. And we see this handle again fired multiple times to build up those layers, that crusty texture, the same thing that's happening on the snail. And then this is studio shot. This is what I have right now in the studio. It's not quite done, but flamingo vase. I'm almost done here. There's just a nice detail of the feet. These are terrible pics, but just to give you an idea of what's really current in the studio. And also this piece is in Marfa, Texas, another big hand. It's really large, hot dog, 90s vibe. I'm going to skip that. This is the last image because I feel like I need to leave time for questions. This is the last piece that I'm going to show you. This is really new. I'm showing in Miami in a couple different fairs. So I'm glazing lots of work right now. In fact, I have a bunch of work in the kiln, and this is a brand new piece. So that's it.
Excellent. I mean, I have a couple questions, and if anybody wants to, test my ability to multitask, we could definitely take some questions in the chat as well, if you're interested. It's interesting. Your recent work is very, while you're certainly questioning many things about the tradition of ceramic, it is more ceramic and less sort of aggressively multi-material or multimedia. Do you think you'll continue in that vein, or is it, I mean, I'm sure there's a little bit of a different, whether it's a site-specific installation versus, going to a fair that also features, the context of decorative items as well.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things happening. So I've recently made lots of vases, and a lot of people want to show those. And I think it's really interesting, right? Because it's like, oh, maybe the other work is too intense for collectors or whatever. The vases just immediately sell, and I'm not making them just because they sell. I think there's something more to explore with them. But one of the fairs that I'm in is Design Miami, and all of that work is supposed to be utilitarian. So that's why there's a candle holder, and that's why there's all these vases. I'm also going to be in Untitled. The Medusa is going to Untitled, as well as another head that wasn't in the slideshow, a big mermaid head, kind of similar to, laying on the side like the Medusa. So I was in a show at the Hole, and I was showing with a painter that was painting vases, still lifes. And so I made a bunch of vases for that show. But right now I'm also making a big monster hand, but it's a night light, like it's holding a light in its palm. And it also will have fur on it. And I'm gluing that fur on in days. So it's all happening. I'm interested in the vases, especially that they're becoming more sculptural, like with the flamingos and with the feet. And I'm interested to see where that will go. I feel like it's similar to the paw. Like I'm just going to keep doing that until, I don't know. I guess I just have to see things evolve.
Mm-hmm. For your upcoming shows, do you have an opportunity to really think of a site-specific installation where the work can be in dialogue with, among the pieces?
Yeah, I mean, right now, this year has been, everything I make goes somewhere, actually. And it's there's been a really high demand, which I think is interesting, not just for vases, for other things too. And I don't really know why. I think it might be because, the nature of my work is kind of intense, and then there's a really big demand for it now. Like, I don't really understand why. Maybe the pandemic has made people like more intense work more. I don't know. Maybe because they've seen vases, it makes the other things more acceptable to them. But I haven't had time to even think, like, I make the work and it just goes. And in a way, it's a little frustrating to me. But I'm just going I'm just like doing deadlines right now, but I'm really looking forward to doing what you said. In Marfa, Texas, that show, there's no vases. It's all like sculptural things. Yeah, I'm thinking about that more. Like, what would I do? I really like the idea of showing all the forms together, showing like a gruesome Medusa head, ideally like next to a vase that looks classic, like all of it, because I think it's about, well, that's how I work. And I think that's also just like a more of a celebration of the medium in a way, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And I just think all the different forms look great together and create a dynamic show. But sometimes galleries, they don't really want that. They want it to seem a little more concise.
Yeah.
So
It
still
depends on
looking, you know,
the context, you know.
still figuring it out.
Well, ceramics is definitely, I feel like a lot of the boundaries have kind of opened up, you know, like the ceramicists are being allowed out of the ghetto and really able to make sculpture in the broader sense. Just sort of recently, but I don't know if you, I'm sure, you know, your take on that is different than mine, but it's certainly great to see shows that, you know, really emphasize ceramic work in a larger context recently. I mean, there've been many over the last few years.
Absolutely. So I started seeing ceramics in a real way in art fairs in 2011. And I was like, oh yeah, this is happening. And then not just ceramics, but any material kind of associated with craft. And so I think a lot about what's happening there is, it makes sense to me that in an age where computers and machines are making artwork, we want to naturally we want to see work that has the evidence of the human in it in a real dramatic way, like fingerprints in the clay, like something so basic. And I think I'm very into how popular ceramics is. I hesitate to use the word trendy because I actually think it's here to stay. I don't think it's a fleeting thing. I don't know if you said trendy. I said trendy, but I've heard people refer to
But
it.
I was careful not to, but yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it is. But I think that in some ways, the same thing happened with representational work. It had to be kind of, you know, there was like trendy body stuff in the early 90s and the trend went away, but the work is still allowed in a way that it was not, you know, previous to that. So
Yeah,
you kind of have to be trendy to get over the threshold in order to just participate sometimes.
absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
Because I mean, during most of my, you know, youth, you know, ceramics was at SOFA, you know, the sculpture and functional object show, not at the mainstream art fairs.
Yeah, yeah.
So kind of, you know, in a ghetto, I guess, but we seem to
Yeah.
have moved past that.
And even like the monster paws, a lot of them have a utilitarian nod, like they're a candle holder, but it's obviously absurd, right? A candle just growing out of the finger of something. And so in a way, I think this is also kind of a ridiculous candle holder, like the snail with the candle. And the vases are kind of doing that too, in a way, like, sure, they're a vase, but what they have mouths and tongues and pierced tongues out of them, or jewelry, they're wearing jewelry, like a body chain, or even the ones that are becoming more sculptural, they're kind of ridiculous, like flamingo heads, or, you know, I have one, a mermaid riding a dolphin. I'm firing work right now. So there's just, they're still absurd in my mind. So yeah, I don't know. I like to kind of like play around with those kind of things and also send it to a design fair where it's like, oh, you want functional things? Here you go. I think it's kind of funny.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions that I want to get to before we run out of time. Yep, and there's some more. I'm interested to hear more about your time in Japan. Why did you choose to work in that country? What type of place or program did you work in? Did any Japanese mythology inspire you?
I went to Shigaraki Ceramic Cultural Park. The reason I went to Japan was because that's like a really amazing residency program that's really hard to get into. But I don't, anyway, whatever. I did it, and I was surrounded by mostly Asian artists, lots of artists from China, Japan, also Thailand, all over. I was the only American artist at the time, actually. And I was surrounded by people that were just like amazing artists that could do things out of clay that I've never seen before. And I'm not always around that. I'm especially in New York. Sometimes I'm kind of the person at the party that everyone asks all their ceramic questions to. And here now I'm in a situation when I was at Shigaraki where I was like learning from other people. I want to learn. Ceramics is vast. I'm always learning. And so I was around people that were putting feldspar in their raw clay and it would melt through I mean, I was seeing things I literally had never seen before. So that was one reason. And I went to a place where the tea ceremony was invented and born. So a really traditional place. Being there actually inspired the dragon imagery. So I made the dragon Loch Ness sculpture after being in Japan. So yes, I was inspired by that. A lot of my friends there that are great artists that show at great galleries loved anime, and anime is something that I don't really know that much about, but that's why I made the pizza face. I actually made that pizza face also while I was in Japan. And then I made the nar mouth after, because I was kind of thinking about, they were making work based on like anime that they loved and meant a lot to them. And anime, I started to see it as like a contemporary version of mythology in Japanese culture, because there are some like characters in Buddhism that embody certain traits, like their hair can go into flames, similar to some anime characters. So I was definitely inspired by what was happening with anime when I was going around in Japan to different sites and gates and seeing how certain deities were depicted. That definitely affected and influenced my work, and then also made me go back and be like, what are my roots? So again, the Jimbo Felix skateboard graphic, that is all because of my experience in Japan. And any of the dragon things that I made, my interpretation of it is also from being in Japan. I loved it there. It was amazing. Amazing.
So we have a question. What do you enjoy the most about making your sculpture?
I mean, that's a good question. It kind of depends on they're also different. The pieces are so different. I feel like I love so many parts of it. I love coil building. I love the process of coil building. And that's what I'm doing with all the vases. With any other work that was in the slideshow, I do it the other way I talked about, where I'm building with solid clay and then hollowing it out. I don't always love hollowing things out because it's very tedious. So I guess the building, I really love the building of things, and I love glazing. And maybe one of my favorite things is pulling things out of the kiln the next day, because I never really know what something's going to look like. With ceramics, there's always an element of surprise. Always, there's things out of your control, and it can be like Christmas. Hopefully, Christmas on a good day, when you open the kiln to see the work and what happened with the glazes. Like that is truly something that is one of my favorite things with ceramics.
Is your building sort of a sequential process, or are you really allowing things to dry and sort of working in, sort of in a planned way where you know that you need to attach something that's going to dry out faster than the rest of it and needs to be
Yes,
put on later,
absolutely.
all that?
Yes, absolutely, all the time. And I actually, that's teaching reminds me of like how I kind of take some of this knowledge that I have for granted, because I realize students don't know that. Like my students don't know that. They don't. So yes, absolutely. So I might block, if I'm building something solid, I'll block out a form really loosely, the whole thing. I'll wait till the clay firms up a little bit to articulate that form more. For coil building, those vessels some of them are very large. If I build it too fast, because I can physically build them very fast, the form will collapse. So I constantly am watching what happens to the clay. And yes, attaching things, when I refer to it as like the temperature of the clay, like the consistency of the clay when it is like the right time, leather hard usually. So yeah, absolutely, I'm doing that.
Yeah, because that can really be, an opportunity for catastrophic failure if you're not sort of, really tuned into how your clay is behaving.
Yeah, you have to constantly pay attention. I tell my students that clay is like a big baby that cannot be neglected, which is true, right? Yes.
Yeah.
You have to be patient, you also have to be the boss. It's so many things.
So you create a lot of artwork about tattoos and splits. What inspired you to create those things?
Well, I have tattoos, so that's one thing. And then if I'm thinking about like the typical vessel, or if I'm thinking about ceramic history, it is a lot of vessels. So it might be like the Delftware, and like the ornate patterning on something like a blue and white base. is basically a vessel has been referred to as a metaphor for the human form. So the vessel's like a body, and we are also decorating our bodies in a similar way. So I just like kind of make that easy connection there. And I think it's, the blue, when I'm attaching those decals, they remind me of temporary tattoos. So I think that's another thing too. Again, the process is informing the imagery. And then the split heads, so I hollowed these things out, and I don't usually cut them in half. I'll cut them in a different way. And I've been doing that for a long time. Like I'll cut a section of a piece like with a wire tool, and that edge will be flat. And then I'll hollow out those sections and put it back together. So I started looking at all these flat shapes from heads because I was cutting it. Again, the process is informing the imagery. And one day I had a head and maybe I cut it in half or something like that. And I liked the way it looked and I kept it. So again, the process is informing the work, but also what the split heads are doing is to me, it makes me think of infinity, or it makes me think of something that's turning in on itself, like it's growing. And so that's why the split heads, those are sort of like referencing geology, or they're like a geode, or they're like a fossil, or they're petrified, because I think about how they're shapeshifters. And so if I'm cutting something and opening it up, to me, that's alluding to this idea that we're all, call it dying, that we're all eternal, that we're all shapeshifters, that everything is expanding, that's the nature of the universe. So it kind of, that little split to me refers to that fundamental idea of transformation. It's about transformation.
It also, for me, evokes, sort of an anatomical reference. I mean, most biology is bilateral, and it is very much like the beautiful anatomy models from the 18th and 19th century. Except
the wax figures.
Yeah, like the Cassini and anatomical Venus. But inside these heads are not the anatomy, but different anatomy that sort of evokes sphincters and orifices and other sort of otherworldly anatomy. So it's a sort of nice
that's a good point. I love those wax figures. And when I was in Vienna, I saw some, and I think it's really interesting because they're like usually female, right? Full figure, completely disemboweled, just intestines splayed out. But their hair is beautifully coiffed.
Right. Yeah, real hair.
In braids. And then they're always wearing a pearl necklace. I think that's one of the reasons I started doing pearls in the work. And they're always on like beautiful pink with fringe bedding. But disemboweled.
Right.
Very interesting.
But like not painfully disemboweled. Just,
right. Oh, an elegant pose, like they're posing for a painter, like they're being painted.
Yeah. Yeah. And those were like both high culture and pop culture, depending, like at some point they were really like the highest of the, the most erudite. And then later they became really like carnival amusements. So they kind of straddled the, both ends of the cultural spectrum.
Right. And those were also happening once we started doing, what's it called after someone, autopsies, basically, right? Because we didn't do those forever. So just think about like at a certain point, at one point in time, people had no idea what was inside the body, which is a crazy thing to think of. And so I think that's another reason why I'm doing the split heads is like, it's also referencing, it's like, a metaphor for the interior world and the exterior world.
So we have one last question and then we'll let you move on. What clay do you like to use when you hollow build? Do you have any type of armature? So you're probably not hollow building that much, but I guess the question of armature certainly comes up frequently for us here. So
yeah. So when I'm building solid and hollowing out, actually when I build with anything, I usually use a clay that has grog in it. And I usually use fine grog so it doesn't interfere with the detail. So usually I use a raku clay body because I'm firing work. If you're just doing sculpture, you don't really need a raku clay body, but I use a raku clay body with grog in it. But if you are firing, it's really good for firing because raku is designed to like heat up really quick and then cool down really fast. So it is, because it's a Japanese firing technique. and it's less prone to cracking. So I feel like it's a really stable clay. So usually I use that, but sometimes I use terracotta, but always with grog. And that's what I like to use for hollowing out. I don't use an armature because what I'm doing is, like, for instance, this piece here, this is small scale, but the other ones too, larger scale, is I build the piece with soft clay, like I talked about, let it get leather hard, whittle it down. And then I cut one section at a time, hollow those sections out and put it back together when the piece is leather hard. So leather hard, you probably all know what that is, but I describe it as like a good chunk of Parmesan cheese is leather hard. It's like firm, but you could carve it, right? So the reason when I hollow something out, when it's leather hard, that means the form that's left can support itself. If I hollow something out prematurely, it will collapse. So the clay is the armature until it gets firm enough that I could hollow it out and it will keep its form. Other than that, I don't use armatures.
Yeah. So you don't ever like build a support around something to.
No, I might prop something up with clay.
Yeah.
So like if I'm building a bust and the chin, like those stalactite faces, those faces
Right.
are very heavy. That's a lot of clay. So the head wants to rip off. Actually, what I've been doing is just building the head separately. But so if the head is on the bust, I'll just have a bunch of clay coming up to the chin, and then I'll put newspaper in between so that clay doesn't stick. That cradles it and just supports the head until the head can be hollow. And then it's a lot lighter. And then I can remove the armature. So yeah, okay, so sometimes clay props. But parsimony, I think of parsimony like the most simple solution. I'm not like building armatures out of other things.
Right. I mean, I'm sure you've seen like Beth Kavner, those pieces have
Yeah.
all sorts of amazing sort of external armatures on them.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, I just don't do that. Maybe I should.
I think it depends on one's work method. I mean, I'm not a ceramicist, so I can't, but whether you're willing to let something, become hard enough to support itself, or whether you want the immediate building that
Yeah.
requires some support.
I think I'm just kind of too impatient for that stuff, really. Always struggling with being more patient.
That's probably true for everybody. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And I know I speak for, everybody in the sculpture department that we were really excited to see more of your work and to talk with you. And we hope to do more of that in the future. So thank you so much. And
Thank you
thanks
so much.
everybody for watching, and bye.